a member of the museum. He teaches at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he's going to give us a talk tonight on James Joyce and Dubliners and kind of the impact that that book had on, and as you know, Dr. Lash Carroll is on as well. We just came off of Bloomsday there in June, so I'm sure we'll have an enlivened discussion. But I'll just hand it over to you now, Jack, and I want to spotlight you if I can, just so that it doesn't go anyplace else. Okay, so you can go. Thank you very much, and introduce yourself better than that.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Good.
I thought I'd just give you just a little background of my personal life and what brought me to the museum. It was here in Rochester. I was delivered here in Rochester, New York in 1937, and proceeded on through grammar school and matriculated at Princeton, graduated in 1959. Staying within the U.S. Navy thereafter for a combination of 15, 16 years in various reserve, active duty, a couple years status. And then I was at Cornell University Law School. And after that, I, among other things, worked at Albany. And that is where I was introduced to the museum. I had been a political appointee by Governor Cuomo Sr., Mario Cuomo. And after working in criminal justice services for a couple of years, I transferred over to the Department of Correctional Services, which was at that time named that. It's now Community Services in addition. And at that time, Tom Callaghan was the commissioner, and a friend of his, and I believe an employee of the correctional department as well, was Joe Dolan. So I was in my office one day, and Joe Dolan walked in, and he, I can't remember exactly the conversation, but this was around 1984. And he said, I've just returned from Ireland, and he placed on my desk, I don't know how all these will show up, these 4 pieces of currency. And it turns out that they were punts. And I'm quite fine. I cherish them these days because, of course, there's a euro in Ireland these days. And I as much as said to Elizabeth there a couple of years ago, I feel they belong to the museum and intend that the museum have them at some point. So Joe, I'm sure, told me of the museum at that time in the Catskills and his involvement with it. And so that was, some 35 years ago. Well, I stayed at corrections for 8 years, and the commissioner moved on, as did Joe. And then in 2016, I was here at St. John Fisher College, and the director at that time of the museum, Ryan Mahoney, appeared with an exhibition regarding the Erie Canal. And from then on, I have been trying to connect consistently with the museum and its great offerings. I have to say I'm a bit awed and humbled to be able to participate, because just for those of you who perhaps did view some of these things, in the recent year and a half, we've had authors, journalists who've written books. We've had Shanachie appeared twice as it was, he was in Ireland, and some of these other authors were also facilitating with Zoom at Ireland. We had the Park Service talk about historic Irish ties. We've had the ambassador, Don Michael, and I'm pronouncing his name wrong, council professors, and of course, Irish independence, 1916 has got terrific coverage with Elizabeth's presentations in a series of articles. So I feel very humble and privileged to share with you tonight. Basically, what I'd like to do is not particularly go into the stories, unless in question and answer you wish to discuss some particular point of them, which I'll try to answer. I'm more versatile in several of the stories than in some of the others. But I want to give you an introduction a little bit with facts and perhaps some anecdotal and some material observations by other people in form of critiquing, so that you can get an idea as to what Dubliners represents and what James Augustine Joyce was trying to present to us in various aspects. I think that probably, just to tell you a little bit about James Joyce, we all heard of him perhaps in general terms because of Ulysses and his renowned epic book. But James Joyce was born in 1882 in Brighton, which is a suburb of Dublin. And he lived until 1941, as it would be. That would be 91 years. It's difficult to highlight this particular gentleman because he was so multifaceted and so talented, if I might say. He had stayed with various disciplines throughout his early years, in consequence of which he gained tremendous amounts of knowledge in various fields. He was very versatile in law. I believe he was in the field of study of medicine for 3 years. He had a great tenor voice. He performed on the same stage as John McCormick, prompting his wife at one time, Nora Barnacle, to say, "James, you should have stayed with music." And of course, she was a terrific counterpart to him, and she was chiding him just on a friendly basis. But he did have a great tenor voice, recordings of which are still in existence. James, in my opinion, deserves our respect for a couple of reasons. I feel that he tried to bring the human condition to a point of understanding, and in a way that was most unique. Number one, he himself experienced it. He had 25 operations for glaucoma, cataract, and another disease of the eye, which was very severe, causing him near total impairment of eyesight at various points in his life. His economic situation, it was ups and downs, so he understood a lot of the situations economically that he describes in his stories. I feel that his experience in life gives him a little bit of a unique edge in terms of credibility as an author. So he was asked several times what it was that Dubliners involved and what it was that he was intending. And at one point, he was quoted as saying that, "My intention was to write a chapter of the moral history of my country, and I chose Dublin for the scene because that city seemed to me the center of paralysis. I have tried to present it to the indifferent public under 4 of its aspects: childhood, adolescence, maturity, and public life." And that's the way the stories are arranged in the text. He has, at this point in his life, that being when he was writing The Dubliners, moved from Ireland to Trieste. He was employed as a translator, as a teacher by Berlitz. I didn't realize that was that old. At that time, that would have been 1904. Of course, we're familiar with Berlitz's popularity and well known as these days. But he was an instructor he was hired as an instructor for Berlitz. And when he got to the point where he was in need of money, he gave private lessons in language and was considered an extraordinarily good teacher. He had also, along the way, written articles for various periodicals, one of which I'll refer to a little later in our discussion here. So Joyce was writing these stories in the time frame of 1904 to 1907. There are 15 stories altogether. The first being The Sisters and the last being The Dead. That is probably the better known of all of the 15. And he chronologically arranged them as you just mentioned. It's pretty well thought that most of the stories were written in Trieste, although there might have been a story or two that was worked on in Pola, Austria. And so when he went to have them published in Dublin, he had insurmountable difficulties. He had difficulties with his publisher. He had difficulties with the printer. He had difficulties because of what we generally refer to as considerations of censorship. What was appropriate to be in print before the public? It's curious. As a lawyer, I can tell you an interesting fact. In Ireland at the time, the law was such that if you printed something that turned out to be slanderous or in print, libelous, the printer who printed the particular piece was liable on a count equal to the number of times it was printed. So if the story were printed 10 times, he would have 10 potential libel suits. So there was some legitimate concern among the publishing people, and there were numerous peoples that he approached regarding printing of the Dubliners stories. One reason being is the setting in the venue in many of the stories was so close that it would be, if you lived in Dublin, very likely that you would recognize where he was telling you this incident was supposed to have taken place. And there were other considerations. The Catholic Church, of course, had a strong opinion as to the propriety of the people's literature that was being printed and available in Dublin. And that caused some concern among the publishers. So Joyce was rather recalcitrant. He just didn't want to change his stuff. He would not back down. And of course, this became a stalemate for some years. So it wasn't until 1914, actually, that the Dubliners was printed, even though it was written some perhaps 7 or 8 or 9, 10 years before. Joyce had one interesting sideline is that Joyce had a very bitter encounter with his publisher in 1912, and he returned to specifically resolve the matter. And in his exasperation of not being able to get a deal reached with the publisher, he returned to Trieste. On his way, he stopped in Flushing, which I believe is in Belgium, and he wrote a poem. It's called Gas from a Burner. And it's the most, I mean, if you were to think of how you could sit down in a short period of time and write something like this, where he takes the narrator as the publisher, and the publisher exposing the various things that he did. And it's a most interesting poem. And it just is a terrific lampoon of all of the inconsistency, if you will, or hypocrisy of the fact that his book would be rejected, and yet these other pieces had particularly reached the public's eye through being published. Joyce finally did resolve with the publisher the matters in question. In most every case, Joyce prevailed. The matters were printed as they were written, and so the book was available and was in 1914. Well, as I said in the initial comment, it's really my idea to kind of get an interest or a basis of interest before you so that you might consider reading this book. Or put it another way, why would you pick up this book and read it? And I think I probably wanted to approach it from the basis of, well, what have other people thought about the book? So I've kind of taken a selection of various people and would like to share with you what they had to say about Joyce and what it would be about Joyce that would interest a reader. What type of characteristics or qualities he has that are so special. The author, Edna O'Brien, who I think most of us are familiar with, currently living in, I believe, London, wrote a book about Joyce. And it's a short book, but it's very well done. And it's available, of course, in print. I believe it's actually Barnes & Noble that prints it. No, it was the Irish Independent publisher. And so in this book, she has this to say about James. No one knew Joyce, only himself. No one could. His imagination was meteoric, his mind ceaseless in the accruing of knowledge, words crackling in his head, images crowding in on him like the shades at the entrance to the underworld. What he wanted to do was to wrest the secret from life, and that could only be done through language, because, as he said, the history of people is the history of language. Another current living author of some highly thought esteem, held in high esteem, is John Banville. And of course, if you've read John Banville, you'll understand why it is that he says, when he was writing a recent book, Timepieces, a Dublin memoir, I don't know how well that shows up. He says that for me as a writer in the making, the fact was that Joyce had seized upon the city for his own literary purposes, and in doing so had used it up, as surely as Kafka did with the letter K. Now, most interesting in terms of the significance and the impact of the Dubliners, I think, is that in let me look here for sure. Excuse me. I think it was in the last 5 years. There was a book published called The New Dubliners. And what this book is a up-to-date address to the 15 stories. And in the introduction, it's quoted as saying, as a volume, these stories work to reveal the enormous changes that have occurred in Dublin and in Ireland since Joyce wrote Dubliners. But they also suggest continuities and connections between Joyce's time and our own. And among the many connections is one for which we should be grateful. Dubliners remain the subject matter of enormously gifted writers. And some of the contributors to this particular book, they each took a story and did what they would think would be an appropriate contemporary version. Dear Mav Binky, Roddy Doyle, Colin McCann, Frank McGuinness, Joseph O'Connor, and there's 4 or 5, 6 others. Now, in addition to that, there's another book of recent vintage, just called The Dubliners. And in this book, as is described by the editor, Thomas Morris, the idea was simple. 15 contemporary Irish authors covering the 15 original stories of Dubliners to mark the collection's centenary. In my own reading experiences, rewritten tales tend to be dull affairs, stories that don't stand on their own legs, whose energies are only derived from other people's engines. But he continues to say, I have no doubt that some of the authors felt when writing these stories, as I did in my own first few weeks in Dublin, and as I still feel this minute, self-spoon, not right for the task, too far from home. Indeed, to take on Joyce is an audacious task, but writing is not a competitive sport, and the authors have taken on anybody. They have read, they have listened, and they have written. And what we have, the readers have been given, is a gift. So in addition, let me go back just with a little bit of time reference to the 1914-15 era, when these stories were available for reading by the general public. At that time, the source of this information, I should say parenthetically, is about 4 or 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Ithaca, New York. At Cornell University, Joyce's selected papers and some of his various correspondence is in the Rare Book Archive. If any of you have been there, it's quite an experience. They fingerprint you, photograph you. You have to store everything that you have on your personal being in a locker, and the procedure is extraordinarily high security. At any rate, I was gained admittance with a friend and spent several hours there. And looking through the various folios, I discovered there were excerpts from press notices that his publisher, Grant Richards, in 1914 had saved and are in the particular archival that I was looking at. One was the Manchester Guardian. The Manchester Guardian was quoted as saying, as to the Dubliners, written with a true art that neither extenuates nor condemns nor even weighs in the moral balance. And that's quite a statement when you consider what his objective was, to be able to write with such a way that you might say would be politically correct, but in more of the sense of the true meaning of it, it's with accuracy and truth. And yet, as it was, there was some pushback from other sources. The Athenaeum, which was a group of intellectual people, as I understand it, in Dublin, wrote, yes, Joyce undoubtedly possesses neat skill, both of observation and of technique. He has knowledge also of the beauty of words and of mental landscapes. Well, I suggest to you that a lot of these stories are as a result of his really comprehensive understanding of medicine and social conduct, laws, if you will. And so he was particularly good at getting it just right as to an appropriate depiction with some authenticity. The New Statesman, which I believe is a London publication at that time, 1914, said, horrible, sordid realities of which you are not spared one single pang. It is all done quite calmly, quite dispassionately, quite competently. So that's what people were thinking of the Dubliners when it first appeared. I wanted to spend just a couple minutes to bring us to where we are with Joyce today as a result, I should say, of being cleared for security, as anybody who is admitted to the Cornell Special Rare Book section is. There are certain collections, Joyce's being one of them, that require an approval by the custodial representative of the literary package of a particular writer. And in this particular case, at this time, it was Joyce's grandson. I could show you this picture. I'm not sure how well it'll appear, but it's a picture of them. You could see James Joyce is on your left, looking at it on the right, with his wife Nora, and his son Giorgio. He had a daughter Lucia and a son Giorgio, both born in Italy and bearing Italian names, and his wife Marcia Fleischmann, I believe her maiden name was. And in the middle is Stephen Joyce, that's Joyce's grandson. And at the time, he was the custodian of the the Joyce collections. Now, there are many of them, as a matter of fact. There's not many, but there's several around the United States that I'm aware of. There's one here in Buffalo, New York, at the University of Buffalo. There's one in Boston College, which is very good. And while I'm mentioning that about Boston College, for those of you who like particularly Irish tomes, reading, there's a great source of current Irish publications. It's called the Irish Literary Supplement, and it's published in conjunction with the Irish program at Boston College. It's a very modest subscription every year, and it contains on a biannual basis the current writings. Here's the funnest piece of what it looks like. And so I was just talking with the editor today. As a matter of fact, it has usually perhaps as many as 2-3 dozen of the current Irish literary products of various authors. And I was just looking through one that was a couple years old, and Joyce is yet alive. The story, the book was written by R.J. Morris. Dublin's urbanism, a measure of modernity. And in the article, it says the best section saw Dublin as a literary place. Time to read James Joyce and Davy Byrne's Pug. So the significance of Ulysses, of course, and also the Dubliners continues on, and it's a kind of the Dubliners themselves is kind of a hallmark of what I would characterize as people's everyday living and the human condition as it pertains to people of all walks of life, as the story is divided into the 3 categories of the sort that depict age. So Joyce has done quite a remarkable feat in the publishing of the publics and the writing of it. I should say parenthetically that when I was at that Cornell archives, I was looking to many things, but this is a copy of this is what Joyce did. He wrote with a typewriter many times, and then he edited it. And this is a copy. I was there for a couple hours, and finally in the 3rd hour, I was interested in this particular piece, which was written for the Italian newspaper where Joyce was living in Trieste at the time, the Piccolo della Sera, which I guess means the evening news, the little evening news, something like that. And I was very interested in it, and I was handwriting it because you weren't allowed to photograph or make any type of process of that sort. Well, apparently, in the meantime, they had actually contacted Stephen Joyce, Joyce's grandson, and he had approved that I would get a copy of it. And the archivist brought over and said, "Here, you may have this." And so this is The Shadow of Parnell, an article that he wrote for the paper. He was, as it was in his family, very much on the side of the politics of Charles Stewart Parnell, as was his father. And even at this point, some years later, the article was written on 16th of May, 1912. And even at this point, he was writing articles regarding Parnell, as one of the stories in the Dubliners is the Ivy, the story of Ivy, the committee room, Ivy Day in the committee room, which deals with the situation of Parnell, which is a very interesting one in and of itself, of course. So as it is, my idea is that if you have an interest in what was life really like in Ireland at the turn of the 20th century, 1900s, if you pick up the Dubliners, you probably get as good a view and an idea as to what the people were contending with, because these stories are not really all happy ending stories. These are stories of people living with conditions that are particularly difficult, not only social, behavioral standards that were required or thought to be necessary to adhere to, but difficult economic times depending on your social status. And in addition, I think Joyce was considered and eager to point out that Irish had such a deep prior culture in both music. There's a story about music in there with a woman with her daughter as a musician, and with art and with reading and the let's say the advancement of the learning. These were things that Joyce was very concerned with subtly, not in a pedantic way, but in a very basic way. And I think he understood very much that these were intrinsic to prior Ireland in its history. And what he saw as part of the paralysis is that these were things that were stagnating, that were at a halt, and they were being impeded. And he felt that this was not, and certainly as obviously it seems, is the best interest of Ireland. So those are the things that I feel are significant to draw us to read the Dubliners. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to engage response. Elizabeth? I believe you're muted.
Myself, yeah, but I'm back. So that was great. I think. Sorry, we have people live here as well. That's why it's a bit messy. Not messy. We're lovely. We're delighted to have you. But between Facebook and live and Zoom, it's all a bit much. So I thought that was great. I loved your talking about the archive holdings in America. I think that's a really good point, that we can travel even within our own state, to see things. I studied at a college, and I remember it being much more accessible, I suppose is the word, than Ulysses. Although I quite enjoyed Ulysses, I think I've mentioned this before. I had a professor who adored Joyce, so you had no choice, but to get in there, or Tony Roche would have killed us. But Dubliners is very accessible. It's a book of short stories, so you don't have to read the whole thing. Some of them are far more, easy, I suppose, or shorter. And then, of course, The Dead is very famous, and some of you may have seen. Was it Ford directed it? I think Angelica Houston is in the film. So that's quite good. At least it's a good way to wet your to dip in your toes into Joyce. So Andrew says, does anyone have any comment on Rejoicing, the new readings of Dubliners, which was edited by Bossinelli and Harold Mosher Jr. in 2015. Did you read that, Jack, or have you come across?
I have not had the opportunity to read it. That's a great observation or a great suggestion. I'll make sure and look at it.
Yeah, Rejoicing. Lovely title. Meg, we'll have to think about that for Bloomsday next year. Not that we would plagiarize anybody, of course. Did you have a question, Meg? Yeah.
I do. Jack, thank you very, very much. Thinking of the stories themselves, what evidence, or do you think there's any evidence that of how Joyce felt about colonialism, Ireland as a colony? I think we tend sometimes to think of Joyce as out of Irish politics, aside from the couple of references to Parnell. But I've been thinking recently about the stories and colonialism, how Joyce is making a statement or taking a stand on Ireland as a colony and Britain as an imposter imposing authority.
I think he did. It's Meg, is it?
Yes.
I believe, Meg, that he had a rather, well, what's the word I'd like? Not obtuse view towards nationalism in Ireland, but I think he was a firm believer in self-determination. He liked autonomy. He liked individuality. He liked the idea of people being able to be themselves and as they were, as they chose. And so I think that probably it would be very clear that he would have viewed the relationship with Ireland and Britain as something specifically, let's say, undesirable. As to that aspect of colonialism that impacted on the Irish people. On the other hand, I would say that as an intellectual, he would certainly always admire and respect Britain as a forerunner in education and cultural advancement in many, many ways. He had kind of a relationship with Britain where some things he and Nora were married in Britain after some years of being together as partners. And so he had a lot of respect for Britain from what I've read in many, many, many ways. And yet I think that I think what he would have the difficulty with would be saying, well, why was our relationship so different way, way, way back than it is now? And if so, what have been the benefits? So he might well look at colonialism he was a very micromanager, you know. He would give you every facet of what was involved. And he might say, well, it certainly has benefited us in such and such a way, but he would probably say because of self-determination that it was imposed in such a way that would be totally unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because certainly he takes the church to task through in many of the stories in Dubliner. And I guess I've been looking more for how he's taking Britain to task as well. So thank you.
Yes, that's true. His view with the church, of course, he had a very deep understanding of the church, probably as deep as a religious. Notwithstanding my personal opinion, and I've read some other writers who have a similar opinion, that he felt as close in a religious sense to Judaism as any faith. And yet he, as a person, he had once was quoted, I believe, he said, "I look at most things through the eyes of a Jesuit." And that's a very illuminating. If I could try for a better word, I would. But I think that's probably what he was saying. So he has a deep understanding of the church. And I dare say he wouldn't want the church to be compromised in some basic principles at all. I think his difficulty was with some of the more administrative or dogma of the church that worked its way along in development through the years and its effect on the Irish people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're right.
I might intrude at this point.
Certainly.
This is Tony, and admire your observation about Joyce and the Jesuits. I think in a strange way, he was more Jesuit than Christian. Christ was not particularly into worship of the intellectuals. He was very much about charity and reaching out to the great deprived and the poor. And Joyce seems to have this empathy with the power of the Jesuit intellect as the bastion for the church in an intellectual, rational sense. So I was struck by the question that the person asked in regard to that. So I think he is, I'm struck by the power of his intellect, which is so great that he sees so clearly. And then you have the Christian command that, well, it's not enough to see clearly intellectually. You must have empathy, you must have charity. And regardless of a person's, background or status or whatever, you reach out to them with a certain empathy. And it's difficult for a man like Joyce, who has an IQ that is off the scale. And I think you're right about, I'm struck by what you said about his appreciation for the Judeo-Christian principle, as we see with Bloom. In the end, while he admires the intellect, he certainly worships the power of the heart and the power of the simple.
And is that not the lesson that Gabriel Conroy learns in The Dead?
Oh, well, yeah, there you go. Yeah, right. Yeah, the power of the heart, conflicting with the mind. And Joyce, who has a mind that's off the scale, certainly recognized the power of the heart, which is part of his genius.
I think your characterization of him is more specifically a better articulation than mine, although I agree with you. I think the one thing that kind of lets us, Tony, conjecture a little bit with some impunity, if I might say, is in an exchange with his wife, Nora, after his demise. She was asked by a very close friend who had been very, very dear to their family and had helped James himself personally. He asked Nora, will we have a priest? And her answer was, I could not do that to Jim. I could not do that to James. And that tells me that there were some discussions of some deep faith tenets involvement in their life together.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Yes, I'm sure there was. Yes, I mean, he was on one hand in this metaphysical realm where he might be discussing with Immanuel Kant about something. On the other hand, he was grounded in, as these stories show, what was going on in middle-class Dublin during the British occupation.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting point, Jack, as I pan the camera around. What about class? And I think to Meg and Tony's point, both, you know, the intersection there of class, and we particularly see it in Dubliners because, you know, each story has little different snippets and there's, you know, terrible poverty as well as the kind of bourgeoisie sort of attitude in Dubliners or the dead. And even in his other works, like he does poo-poo a lot of the, you know, the Irish Citizen Army and the nationalism. So and the fact that, you know, as you said, he hearkened to England as being the torchbearer in terms of education and not like the glorified, you know, saints and scholars and hedge schools of Ireland. Can you talk about how all of that intersects, or if it does, please?
I don't think he abrogates Ireland's position as one of prominence in education. I think he's troubled by its decline in, shall we say, effectiveness, and the fact that it had not been adhered to. And I point to it as probably, I've got so much stuff to read yet about the man. Mm-hmm. As Tony said, he's in some ways he's an enigma, but basically, as you learn, if you study Joyce, it turns out that he really ends up being very clear and tells you really why he's thinking and responding in such a way in his word usage. But I think that he's probably troubled more by the idea that why were these things of the past, these hedge schools? And as I was trying to bring myself to the point of the importance of language. And the Gaelic language was really where it was at. It was such a combination of different languages to begin with. It was an Indo-European language, and they worked on it. They really put it together, and so that it was such that it would be a universal way of conversation, whether you were an academic or whether you were just an everyday peasant, if you will. You could converse in this language and not have any difficulty of conveying the way you felt in terms of feelings. The Irish Gaelic Dictionary, copy I have, which was obtained from me by Dr. O'Sullivan, a Rochesterian who had moved here from Dublin, whose family were all doctors, is parenthetically relevant perhaps. This particular dictionary, I'll look up words and it's endless. I mean, the nuancing of a given word is just unimaginably comprehensive. So I think that's what troubled Joyce. And I think that's why he would, word usage to him was so important, and he wanted to get that word that would reach somebody's understanding at any social level or any level of education. When I was first studying Joyce, I'll never forget. I think the word was Levant. He used the word Levant, which we know is geographically referring to an area in the Eastern Mediterranean. And yet, when you look at the word definition, there's 4 or 5 definitions, and the word fit perfectly in every meaning, and they weren't close. So I think that's what his understanding was. I think his father, John, instilled in him the value of education. And notwithstanding all the brothers and sisters in his family, he was given the advantage of a good education early on, and it whetted his appetite, so he continued to learn. And I think that he was socially so stricken, as Tony said, in a way. Joyce was so socially stricken with the future of the human race, if you will, not only in Ireland, by what was happening, by certain agendas, involvement, and what was being lost, on the other hand, in a social sense, that he tried in his writings to, in a very unoffensive way, say this, we should be thinking about this sort of thing in our system, in our culture.
Yeah.
I have to agree with that, and I'm struck by his the genius of his intellect. That what you were saying about the word. In the beginning was the word. Let's not kid ourselves that Joyce was very aware of that. He was such an educated person. He saw the power of language, the power of the word, that extraordinary ability to capture something in a sentence. And you get this brilliant intellectual Jesuit genius. And then he, with the first story in the Dubliners, you get a simple, direct sentence that captures the condition of a particular human being. So I'm always struck by his extraordinary intellectual power coinciding with a certain empathy for the human condition.
Yeah, well, it basically strikes me that he more or less hated hypocrisy, of any sort. And so maybe even the fact that he was censored, his books were censored, he obviously had a lot of issues, because he didn't glorify, the nation or the Celtic myths the way Yeats did, or, that kind of thing. That wasn't his scene. So I don't know whether it's modernism or realism or post something, but he's or neo something. But I think that's right, Tony. That's a good point. Questioning kind of everything, an investigative mind, but also the empathy at the heart of it, without leaving any room for, hypocrisy, I think is great. Did anyone hear?
I think you're right about that. And his, sometimes we're disappointed that Joyce wasn't more of a nationalist. We consider the great intellects in the 1916 rebellion, from Pierce, MacDonagh, the poets, etc. But at the same time, his vision was so great. He had an impatience, I think, with nationalism, because he was so into the universal view of humanity. So it wasn't that he was, anti-nationalistic so much as I think he didn't identify empathetically with the nationalist cause, because he was wrestling more in a metaphysical realm on the one hand, and on the other hand, real Dublin middle class life in 1904.
Yeah, he was interested in the restoration of the composite that would represent nationalism. I think that's a great observation, Tony. Working with his mentality was so extraordinarily difficult for many people. As he said, the complexities are in there on purpose, and I don't think he meant it in an aloof way or a stymieing way. I think he was trying to encourage effort by the people to establish a culture of understanding and restoration of learning, if you will.
Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you for that. Yes.
So do you guys have a question? No. Not to put you on the spot. Okay, good. No, they're being quiet. Not this time. And nobody on Facebook with a question. There's about 12 people watching live on Facebook.
Can I just have a question? Really, I just wanted to focus in on one of his stories from Dubliners. Sort of curious about everyone's interpretation. The opening story is the sisters. in Dubliners. And I'm wondering how you all interpret the character, I think Father Flynn, I think Flynn is his name, the priest in The Sisters. What are your thoughts? Jack, certainly to begin with you, but I'm curious to hear what others think as well.
Well, considering what Tony's observed about Joyce's relationship with religion is important, I think that Joyce has himself in there as Father Flynn. I think that's he's confounded. Why is this change simony? Why have we simony? This is something that isn't acceptable by certain people's standards.
Mm-hmm.
And the priest and he positions it as an adolescent story because it's what does this young man have to gain by looking at the church vis-a-vis its priest as a role model?
Mm-hmm.
What is he getting here? What is it that's important in terms of principles and tenets and upbringing? And so Joyce put himself in a lot of these stories in an indirect way. And he used information that was personal to his family in some of the stories. I might add that, Peg. I'm not sure that's exactly illuminating to your question, but that would be my thought. Perhaps someone else has something to.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, do you see him as a restricting, paralyzing character, a paralyzing effect on the young boy, that boy in the story, or is he a liberating force who himself has been restricted by the church and he dies disappointed?
That's a brilliant comment, because it opens up the whole question of what the young man learns from the priest. On the one hand, you feel discouraged or depressed, and then you think suddenly there is this opening into the whole Latin culture, the history of the church, and the peculiar, pressures on this particular priest. So you get the sense that there's a tremendous attraction on the part of the narrator towards the church and the power of the Jesuits and the whole intellectual tradition going back to Augustine and Aquinas and Maimonides or whatever. And then suddenly you're back into this, he brings you back into, well, this is, a family, they've lost somebody. So you're right, it creates a dilemma for us, a confusion. But in the end, I think he's suggesting that he learns something from this priest who went through some terrible trauma.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tony, but I think criticism is really split on this. Some critics see the priest as representing the paralyzing effects of the church and a negative impact on the boy. And I don't see that. I see
I agree with you.
Challenging him as his intellect. And it's when the priest dies, the little boy is left with the paralyzing effects of his environment.
Yeah, exactly. And Joyce seems so aware of a metaphysical reality beyond the material.
He does.
That he wrestles with. On the one hand, I sometimes see him as when I started to reread this stuff, I saw him, should I be a writer or a Jesuit?
Yeah.
But salvation is probably with the writer. I wonder if our professor would agree.
What do you think, Jack?
That's you, I believe, Elizabeth, that Tony is.
They're calling me the professor. Yeah, well, I don't know. I was trying to vaguely familiarize myself with it to this afternoon, and I didn't really have time. I should have read it while I was on vacation. I'm wondering, and I know they don't really allude to it, and I think what makes is that it's a bit ambiguous. Like, we don't really know what the kid feels. We don't know how we feel about the priest, even though simony is mentioned. Given what came out later on about the Irish Church, you kind of wonder, is that why the ambiguity is there? Like, could there have been a worry underneath it all, like that there was more going on, or, because there's definitely a hint that something is inappropriate about the relationship with the boy and the priest. So I don't know. I mean, what was your exact question, Tony, again?
Well, I was thinking
It was
about that.
Peggy,
The
actually.
simony had to do with the trading of knowledge.
Yeah,
No,
well, yeah, that'd be a
well,
nice way of looking at it, wouldn't it?
it was like,
I don't think Luther would have left if the simony was just with knowledge.
right, yeah, that
Yeah.
whole metaphysical issue
Yeah.
is there. And Joyce, projecting the child with the brilliant mind, senses something about this man that other people don't.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
If I'm correct in seeing him as the narrator, or at least
Yeah.
I see him
Yeah.
wrestling with metaphysical questions
Right.
while the rest of us are talking about life and death.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a paradox, I realize, but
Yeah.
He
No,
has
I
that one. He has that one little snippet, if I remember it correctly. This is not a story that I was so as familiar with as others that I've done word by word, actually. He has that characterization of the priest seemingly at a point of some diminution of mentality, dementia, laughing and in a as if a quasi confessional aura.
Yeah.
Now, what was it that was wrong, that was maybe not wrong, but that was humorous? And there's no coincidences in Joyce. I've read it and I agree with it. He thought out these things, and I thought maybe does somebody, while we're thinking about this story, does somebody have an idea or conjecture as to why does he characterize that priest in that style?
I guess one thought I have is that the priest realizes the pointlessness of his life in the church. So I think that's the priest's disappointment, that his chosen path has been for naught. There's that one, like you said, Joyce, there are no accidental details. And there's this one point where the priest has an empty chalice and he drops it. And I think, the emptiness of the church is symbolized there. And
The brokenness, yes.
the priest realizes it.
Yeah, but again, there is the effect on the individual, the irony. Of course, Joyce, of course, is the master of irony, realizes that whatever the priest's doubts might be, he conveys something to this young man, that there is something greater than the material,
right,
than the mundane.
Right.
So he's prodding him to reach beyond it's a strange paradoxical power in Joyce, where I'm just writing these practical sentences, and then suddenly there's a metaphysical hint,
right,
that this young man may see something that we don't.
And I think that's why the other adults in the story don't think it's a good idea for the boy to associate with the priest.
No, but at the same time, that peculiar uncle recognizes that the priest has some, not magical, but strange power.
But they don't like it. They don't trust.
No, they don't like it. No,
They
because it's a middle class culture,
right.
And we're all very material, and we want to succeed,
be more contained,
and we don't want this child suddenly recruited for the Jesuits.
Yes, yeah.
I know the uncle says at one point, you got to box your own corner. In other words, don't challenge yourself. Don't spread your wings, but stay contained.
Yeah, and that's what Joyce is brilliant at. He recognizes the limitations on all of us as middle class culture. We want our children to succeed. We want them to get good jobs. We want them to be happy. On the other hand, we recognize that they have these artistic visions. They have these dreams. They have these passions for justice, whether it's the environment or whatever. And we don't want to restrain that. On the other hand, we worry that they'll get hurt if they reach beyond themselves. The old mother and father fear about the children. But I cannot possibly be less appreciative of Joyce's sentences. You know, the first sentence in The Sisters.
Mhm.
You know, I'm thinking straightforward, simple sentence. No pedantry, no pretentiousness.
No.
You know, no quote erudition, and yet you get that brilliant message.
Mhm.
This is reality, folks. Wake up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of anecdotal material that I don't view necessarily as academic, but I think it's very germane to his mentality, as you very wonderfully reflected, Tony, and also pegged there. You know, his wife, of course, was a gal who from Galway, who was a very, shall we say, everyday type of woman, not formally educated, but yet in the Gaeltacht, that's significant, from the Gaeltacht.
Yes.
And when she gets together with Joyce, at one point she says to him, she said, James, why don't you write something that people can understand? And he says to her, why don't they see the humor in it? And so he had understanding of the support aspects, the subtleties, the importance of conversation, the importance of civility, if you will, between all walks of life. And that's where his brilliance really is, and as I see it. And
I think you're absolutely right about that. His brilliance is there, and our failure to see the humor, because humor is a form of grace, as you know, ultimately.
Yes,
but the other thing that
humor is an
puzzles me
opening
about
as well. I mean, to be candid, to be exact about it, And so there again, he had that word. He knew what word to tell her and show her where the perhaps other considerations of his works were to be viewed. Excuse me, Tony. Go ahead.
But that the one thing that struck me about Joyce was, and maybe my ignorance, his failure to appreciate the profound effect of the Great Famine on the culture, on the history, on the nationalism question. He doesn't seem to delve into that at all.
I'm thinking I don't think it's in the Dubliners. If I'm mistaken. I can't explain his spontaneity in this situation to your question is left me. He likes to deal with the absolute, and there's good deal of evidence to say that there was some mischief afoot with the famine.
Yeah.
Whether it be the exporting of all the Irish food that was available that could have been for the local folks, or whether it be Trevelyan's, let's say, draconian types of approach to solution, however well intended subjectively they may have been.
Right.
I've heard so many controversial statements about the famine. I have mixed feelings about it myself.
Yeah, the laissez-faire philosophy, for example. Yeah. You're absolutely right about that. But I think I wonder, did he miss the profound effect on the Irish culture of that disaster in terms of not just physical, but cultural and political and
Tony,
spiritual even.
I wonder if we do see, though, a psychological legacy of the famine through Dubliners, with this psychological fear of taking a chance. Is that the legacy that lives in the 20th century?
Excellent point. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. Yeah, that might very well be an intellectual, psychological legacy. The habits we develop just to survive.
Right.
Made us more subservient, acquiescent, or whatever, material.
We see the death of the imagination play out in Dubliners. And perhaps
the death of the imagination. Wow, what a statement. Huh? We could write a book about that.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
just reading a quote here. Kevin Whelan has argued that beneath its calm surface of Joyce's work is pervasively disturbed by the presence of the famine. The post-famine condition of Ireland is the unnamed horror at the heart of Joyce's Irish darkness.
Wow.
Kevin Whelan. He says it's the conspicuous exclusion that is saturatingly present as a palpable absence, deliberately being held at bay. The terror of a soul of a starving Irish village. Now, they say, obviously, this is more kind of obvious in Ulysses, but there's a lot, apparently, again, because of the paralysis themes in Dubliners, another guy, links that directly to the famine. In the eyes of many observers, the devastation wrought upon Irish society during the famine was such that the entire culture seemed reduced to the kind of enervation associated with hysteria and a great silence.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is incredible. And of course, we can't forget that Dublin was a garrison town, as UKerry people would say.
Yeah. Oh, we have another chat. Joyce was a product, of the famine, says Jean, and his insights are reflective of this pain. Yeah, I kind of agree with you there, Jean. You know, don't forget, like, very many people in Ireland didn't speak about it at all, including politicians, for a long time. I mean, De Valera, 20 years after this book was published, was pulling down workhouses because he said they were a blight on the landscape. So there is a massive silence around the famine, sort of in general. I think... what's that book? Paddy's Lament is probably one of the few, that came out, and it's really only in the last 30 years that we're kind of grappling, I think, with that as a society, But maybe, as Meg said, it's the kind of the absences and the silences are what are there. Wait, you can hear me talking. So is that it? If we don't have any more questions or comments, I'm going to check my Facebook page again. No comments there. Everyone is liking you and thumbs upping, but we're not getting questions. So guys, I'd say we'll leave it there. This was very productive. Oh, Jack, I so appreciate your personal journey with Joyce. You're such a gracious lecturer, says Jean. Dubliners changed my life. Oh, Jean, you should have come in. Yeah, it's a fabulous book, I think, and I hope you all will read it now. And Peggy is commenting, but I don't have the comment in front of me. So I don't want to cut anybody off. If anyone else does have one last question or something, we can, but this was a brilliant turnout, and we've had a lot of attention on Facebook too, but no questions.
A great reawakening. Thank you,
Dr.
Stack, and thank you, Dr. Gallagher.
Jean said her 3 graduates with her, so her thoughts are scattered, but I'm glad you enjoyed the book, Jean, and I hope you enjoyed tonight. And our in-person audience. And Jack, thank you so much for doing this. We'll have to have you back. Tone, we have to have you present as well at some stage. We've been emailing each other, but no avail. So I'll invite you for maybe a September or October lecture.
I hope so.
Yeah, good. Put it in the calendar. I'll call you tomorrow. Okay, thank you, Dr. Lash Carroll, for your comments, and everyone for tuning in. We're delighted to have you. And when are we back? Wednesday, we're back with a very fascinating talk on Lawrence Thompson. He's a famous sculptor. He created the famous Napoleon statue and a number of Civil War veterans. He was born in Abbeyleix in Ireland and died in the lunatic asylum here in Albany, so that's kind of a sad. Oh Lord.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll see that on Wednesday with that's Zoom only. I don't think he's coming up here for that, but I'll reiterate that on the website tomorrow. Okay, so thanks everyone. Have a great night. Jack, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was brilliant.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for awakening this interest again.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Good night. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.